going on, everybody? It's Mr. Lutz here to talk with you about the Scramble for Africa. Not the biggest fan of that title. Kind of implies like it's just Europeans grabbing and Africans having nothing to say about that grab. But anyway, we're going to focus on European imperialism during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and we'll talk about some things you already know, the motives why practice imperialism here, how does it get done, and we'll also kind of do a comparative focus. How does it look in North Africa versus East Africa versus South versus West? So yeah, let's just kind of talk about what you should understand by the time the video is over. First thing is going to be, why are Europeans wanting to imperialize Africa in the first place? Which should sound really familiar to you because it's the different things you've talked about already. It's just more of a specific application now. So we'll see, I think, predominantly the economic factors, remembering that these lands are going to be places where raw materials can be secured to help these newly industrialized countries of Western Europe continue in their process of industrialization. And then we'll see it being a place where these manufactured goods can be sold as well. We'll also see the cultural or the social desire to practice imperialism, which was the whole like civilizing mission. You'll notice I throw up quotes a lot when I read something that a source tells me they're intending to do, but it's not really happening, because you'll see Europeans talk about bringing culture and civilization to people, and it doesn't really end up happening by and large. We'll also kind of talk about the political competition between European nations that comes as a result of imperializing throughout Africa. And we'll discuss a little bit about how Europeans are accomplishing their goal. And then we'll chat a little bit as well about how Africans are responding to imperialism. But that's going to be something we'll discuss more in class, particularly with this map here, which is going to be actual resistance efforts against Europeans. You can see all throughout Africa. So rather than going through all those different movements, I think that'll be something we particularly discuss more in the classroom, as opposed to this introductory chat that we'll start on here. So when we talk about how Europeans practice imperialism throughout the world, there's really two different ways they govern the colonies they control. And the one is through indirect rule, which we've mentioned a little bit. If you recall, that's by keeping the native rulers primarily in charge, but really they're in charge only insofar as they are carrying out the directives of what the Europeans want them to do. And the Europeans are creating economic or political incentives to those leaders carrying out these rules. So it's kind of like a puppet type thing. It's a good way to think about it. And it's making sure that these leaders are continually carrying out what you want. So there's no new ideas emerging. There's no new capable styles of rule, because new implies different ideas, fresh ideas. And if there's fresh ideas, then that means they're probably going to challenge the status quo of European control. And of course, the imperial powers don't want to see that happen. So that's indirect rule. Direct rule is basically saying we are a French colony, therefore we are going to get officials from France, ship them over into West Africa, where they will govern on our behalf. So it is a direct control in a very literal sense of the word. But comparatively, one similarity, whether it's indirect rule or direct rule, something that you will see between the two is segregation. You will see that social separation existing between the white colonial authorities and the native people, whether that be them being in Africa or in Asia or in the Americas, for that matter, in earlier time periods. So there's not going to be a lot of social intermixing, especially during the 19th and the 20th centuries, as racism becomes a more predominant feature of European society. So there's a quick overview for you of what we kind of just covered. Indirect rule being on the left-hand side, using those traditional local government officials, government institutions being based on European styles, maybe preserving some local rule. And you see this with British colonies, some US colonies as well. Whereas direct rule, again, you're bringing in those foreign officials. You are not allowing for self-rule. And you'll see this with the French, with the Germans, and the Portuguese. So there's different forms of imperialism. Sometimes I gloss over this a little bit more than I'd like to, but as you see this in Africa or in India or in China, our three regions of focus, we'll see a lot of colonies, places where they're being governed by a foreign power. We'll sometimes see protectorates where a place might have its own internal government, but there might be regions or areas within that land that are under the control of an outside power. This would be the case in point in Egypt. We'll see spheres of influence, particularly in China in a later date, where we see outside powers claiming exclusive investment or trading privileges within a particular territory. Other times we'll see, and this will be later on in our course, I think, economic imperialism, where there is a state that is independent but less developed that is being controlled or heavily influenced by private businesses from other countries. Case in point, one place, the Dole Fruit Company, believe it or not, it's true, has a very large influence in Hawaii. So let's start with our kind of regional discussion. And before we get into this, I just want you to look at the map on the right-hand side. And I want to break down some of these colors for you so you see who kind of controls what, who's majorly influential in this region and who's kind of less influential. So the biggest and most powerful authorities in the region, you see the French controlling a huge swath of West Africa. A little bit to a lesser extent, you see the British down in Nigeria, in the Gold Coast or modern-day Ghana, Sierra Leone, the Gambia. Even to a lesser extent, you see the Spanish kind of along that northwestern coast and up in Morocco. Portuguese holding out a little sliver here and there. And then the Germans down in Cameroon and Togoland as well. So we see a couple things. We see the British and the French being extremely powerful here. We see the Spanish and the Portuguese, kind of those two 16th century power brokers, fading in terms of their relevance with empire. And we see the Germans starting to enter. And that's going to come into play later on in this unit, I think especially later on in this discussion as well. So why are all these countries here? Slave trade's gone. It's banished, and you can see that on the slide. The big motivating thing here is going to be oils, particularly palm oil, because it's going to be used to help grease industrial machinery. It can be used in the production of soap. If you ever think of like palm olive soap, think about that word, palm olive. Palm and olive. Those used to be the two oils that were used as the primary ingredients in that soap. But also, too, I think that there's just an idea of claiming territory here for the sake of preventing others from getting it. I think in the case of French West Africa, so we do see those political motives as well. Moving right along, North Africa, a little bit different here. You can see the British pretty powerful here in Egypt and Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. You can see the French in Chad. But then you see Ethiopia, and that's not a color that we've seen yet here. And that's because Ethiopia is never colonized by a European power. We'll talk more about that in class specifically, but for now I want to focus on Egypt in particular. We talked about Egypt really briefly with Napoleon because he had conquered it in 1799 and then booked it back to France to overthrow the French government, where he would then become the consul and later the emperor of France. So as soon as he left, basically, Egypt was there for the taking. And this guy, Muhammad Ali, please, not the boxer, is going to take control. And he is going to lead an independence movement. And though he's still going to be technically part of the Ottoman Empire, he's going to be able to kind of do his own thing there. And he's going to become pretty powerful in the region. That's because he decides to modernize Egypt in a lot of different ways. He modernizes the military, kind of basing a lot of the tactics and the weapons and the organization off of the French. He's going to modernize the schooling system off of the French as well. He's going to start to industrialize Egypt a little bit, really emphasize cotton production so that at a minimum that can be shipped back to the textile industries in Great Britain. And doing all these modernizations, though, it costs money, and he's going to run into some financial troubles, and that's going to lead to the French initially and then the British starting to move in because they had paid these loans or given these loans And now, when they're not being paid off as much, the British start to step in to secure their interests in the region. And one thing that they're interested in is going to be a canal, right where you see it says Suez, that would connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. So the Suez Canal is going to be finally constructed and then controlled by Great Britain by 1875. And why the British want this Suez Canal is because it's a lifeline for them to their most profitable colony of India. If you think about it, at this time, there's no more American colonies, so India is the big moneymaker for the British. And they're going to basically take over after it bankrupts. The Suez Canal construction bankrupts the French. Egyptians kind of resent British influence in the region. They're going to try to revolt against it in the early 20th century. And the British are going to put down that revolt and basically make Egypt a protectorate where they're going to have a military presence there to ensure their economic investments in the region are secured. So we've got this world map here, and my big question there is, why would the British want this Suez Canal so badly? Now, to orient yourselves, here's my mouse cursor. If you see where it says Israel right here, basically where the L is in Israel, like right to the left of my mouse cursor, that's where the Suez Canal is constructed. So we've got the Mediterranean here, Suez Canal there, the Red Sea here, Indian Ocean here. So why do the British want this canal? Think about it. It saves them this trip, going all the way down the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then into the Indian Ocean, India. You now cut off all this sailing around Africa, and you can just sail straight through the Mediterranean, in through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, and then out into the Indian Ocean. So it's going to save them a lot of time, and they're not going to be the only European powers wanting access to this canal, so they can charge tolls on other countries wanting to sail through the canal. So Central Africa, bit of a different story here. We have the Belgian Congo, which prior to the 19th century has been effectively considered the part of Africa that is known as the Dark Continent, which is a European term given not only for the complexion of the people of Africa, but also for European awareness of this interior part of Africa. And so there's going to be two men, Livingston and Stanley. Livingston had kind of been roaming around Africa for a while in time, and people were aware of him doing this, and they became really interested and wanted to hear more about what he was doing. Because sometimes, given communication of that period, it was just thought he had died. And so newspapers wanted to send their reporters out to Africa to try to catch up with Livingston to figure out what was going on. So this one reporter, Stanley, comes into contact with him in Africa and basically joins along with him. And one of their missions becomes to find the source of the Congo River. Where does it originate from? Because they know the Congo River's mouth is in the Atlantic. It's in the Atlantic Ocean, which is about right here. So they find its source right in the interior of Africa, and they realize we now have this highway, so to speak, that can lead us right into the interior. So they start to sign, or they start to have rulers throughout this region of Africa sign over agreements, basically unaware of the fact that they're signing over the right to governing this part of Africa. And Livingston and Stanley are going to market this colony effectively to all these different European rulers. And a lot of people kind of tune them out. They don't really know what's there, if it's going to be profitable or worth it or not. But King Leopold II of Belgium is a willing and captive audience. He's interested because Leopold II of Belgium has no colonial possessions to call his own. So when he hears about this opportunity in Central Africa, he jumps on board. And at first, it's not very profitable. In fact, he's losing money in his investment. The resources there's ivory to be traded, which can make him a little bit of money. But then bicycles start to become popular and automobiles become popular. And both of those things require tires. And both of those tires are made of rubber. And whether you're aware of it or not, rubber originally was harvested from the sap of a rubber tree, which it isn't today, but that's what it was back then. So he basically creates rubber plantations throughout the Congo Free State and uses the Congolese as forced laborers, basically holding them hostage to produce the rubber that he demands of them. And you can see it says there, his policies most likely killed about 10 million natives. Now, I'm not glossing over this information because I don't want to talk about it. There's another video, and I do want you to pause this in a moment when I give you the word to do so, and I want you to search up Congo, the Brutal History on YouTube, and I'd like you to watch that. So I want to read this for a second because there's some things in red that are important to take note of. It says, please watch this video as an introduction to introduce yourself to some more specifics about the Congo Free State. Now, it does say there are some graphic scenes in the video. I suggest to look away from 245 to 320 when they reenact the hands of the Congolese being cut off by the Belgian Force Publique. What would happen is the Force Publique was basically the police force in the Congo, and they would be given a certain number of bullets to use in a day because they didn't want to just, the government didn't want to endlessly give up an endless supply of bullets to be used freely. So in order to demonstrate you've used your bullets effectively, you'd have to come home with proof. And that proof was in the form of the right hands of the people who were shot with these bullets. And they show obviously a fake reenactment, but it's graphic enough that it's not worth watching. So please, 245 to 320, just move right through that. You can pick up watching again when you hear the quote that says, only the whip can civilize the black. And it does say, there's also a pretty tough scene at 8:40 to 9 minutes that's from the Holocaust to try to draw some comparisons between the two. You can watch it again when the narrator says, whatever the origins of the word racism, you can pick up from there. I understand I can't control what you do, but I don't think it serves having any real educational benefit to watch those two clips. They're tough scenes to look at, so I just wanted you to be aware of that. But please, right now, go ahead, pause this clip, and watch Congo, the Brutal History on YouTube, and I'll catch you back on the other side. Okay, so after having watched that, I wanted to give you this quote to look at. And this is a quote from King Leopold II. And after having seen that and the brutality of his regime in the Congo, this is what he says he's doing when he colonizes the Congo Free State. He says he's doing this to, quote, to open to civilization the only part of our globe which it has not yet penetrated. To pierce the darkness which hangs over entire peoples is, I dare say, a crusade worthy of this century of progress. So you just see what a lie that is. He's talking about this desire to bring them into the civilized world. And you can see that what he does is anything but civilized. And it's all for the purpose of economic profit. So that's why I kind of really disagree with that idea that like this is done to bring these people into a more civilized state. We can talk, 100 years on, maybe they have more developed political institutions, but did they need to, and I say they being a general term for the places that were colonized throughout the world, did they need to undergo this experience of imperialism in order to be able to achieve an evolution in the way that they're being governed? I think that's a big question that we need to consider. So East Africa, kind of moving along here, we see a lot of British presence in Uganda, British East Africa, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, down into South Africa. And then we see German East Africa, kind of just slashing it right in half. So there's a rivalry that exists between Germany and Britain because they're both interested in different parts here. And that's going to be kind of the kickoff of a rivalry between Germany and Britain that's going to last for a while in our class now. So there's going to be a conference held in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 where European imperial powers are going to basically agree upon a suitable division of the continent between the imperial powers. And in this Berlin conference, no African delegates are going to attend, which is worth noting. So you see to the left here a map of Africa after the Berlin Conference, and you see orange being British territories, green being French, blue Spanish, purple German, red Italian, the Portuguese, kind of a darker green color here, and two free territories. We talked about Ethiopia earlier on in the western part of Africa, and then, the eastern part of Africa, and then you see Liberia in the western part of the continent, but the rest of it colonized. And I have this little map down here because this shows you the different language families of Africa. My point in showing you that is these lines that are being drawn to divide these different territories among the European powers don't have any reflection of the cultural or the language or the history of the different peoples throughout Africa. And so you're dividing or forcing together people that don't have much in common. So throughout the 19th and 20th century, it's going to lead to some difficulties in being governed by people who you don't necessarily agree with. And we're going to see that play out, unfortunately, in our class later on this year. So finally, to move on to South Africa, it had started to get colonized by Europeans, primarily the Dutch, in the 1600s when they had been sailing into the Indian Ocean to kind of start trading. They had established a trade post in Cape Town, and their descendants had remained there, kind of carved out a life of farming and agricultural living, and they became known as the Boers or the Afrikaners. And they had been there then for centuries. By the 1800s, the British are starting to move into their territory. And there's some disagreements over what's the land to be used for. The British are finding gold and diamonds in the region, and the Boers want to continue this agricultural lifestyle. They practice slavery. The British had abolished slavery. So there's a butting of heads between Boers and the British. So the Boers go on what's called the Great Trek up into these areas like the Orange Free State, Transvaal, and they're continuing on their lives trying to live separately from the British. Now, they do butt heads with the Zulus, who were a native tribe in South Africa, but they eventually start carving out their own way of life once again. Enter Cecil Rhodes, who is the founder of De Beers Diamond Company, which at one point in time controlled 90% of the world's diamond production. And he is going to desire the British have this north-south corridor throughout Africa. That's kind of this cape that is South Africa to Cairo territory that becomes theirs. And he knows there are diamonds and gold to be found in these Boer territories, so he wants the British to move into these territories. Now, as they do so, the Boers are resisting against that, and they're using what's called guerrilla warfare to fight against British encroachment, which means they are launching these small-scale surprise attacks throughout the land. And the British don't know specifically who is doing it other than it's the Boers generally. So they're going to use what's called collective punishment. We can't pin down who specifically is to blame, but we know they come from your general group. So we're going to punish your general group. They're going to burn Boer farmlands. They're going to place women and children of the Boers and Africans into these concentration camps that are unequipped to handle this significant amount of people in these camps, which will result in the deaths of tens of thousands. But it will eventually result in the success of the British here, and they will come to govern South Africa. So now you have white British government controlling not only the Africans of the continent, but also the white Boer population. And the Boers are still resentful, but the British are going to try to bring the Boers into the fold by ensuring they will have a privileged place in society by creating laws that will institutionalize racism in South Africa. And that is going to hang on in South Africa for the next 100 years of this country's history. So we'll see problems stemming from this time period go well into South Africa's current and contemporary history. Finally, the last thing here, just to generalize the response to imperialism, not only do we see this map once again, there is going to be resistance, as in armed resistance to imperialism, but there's going to be an intellectual resistance as well. And that takes place in the form of nationalist movements forming. You have some elites from Africa who are getting educated in European-styled schools. So generally what they're seeing is European ideals, democracy, equality, liberty, freedoms, yada, yada, yada. But they don't see the Europeans practicing that back in the colonies. So the Africans want those rights for themselves, meaning they want Europeans out. So by the early 20th century, they're going to start to advocate for independence. And they'll be doing it before that as well. But it will start to look like a more nationalistic, intellectual type movement in the late 18 and early 1900s. But it's going to be a long time before a lot of them realize independence. Many of them will have to wait until after World War II. So that's where we leave it for now. The last thing I wanted to let you know is that there will be a comprehension quiz on this material. It'll be multiple choice, so how you can kind of check to make sure you've processed some of the major things that we've talked about here. Go to Socrative.com and enter the room name WHL2CV, and you can practice with the quiz that I have posted there for you. But that's everything I've got for you now. So until I see you next time, take care, everybody.